Hello and welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today I am with Cynthia Hanold, who is not very politically active, but she identifies as a social democrat. And she is an archaeologist in doing her PhD at the University of Alabama. Cynthia, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, John.
Is there anything, was that a good introduction?
That was a great introduction. That was
Oh,
perfect.
thank you. Okay, can you tell me what is the best form of government, in your opinion?
So, in my opinion, I think that the best form of government is one of the people. So, it's not so much about labels. I'm an archaeologist, and labels mean different things to different people at different times. But about whether the political party or an individual that's chosen to represent the people is actually fighting for the will of the people. So I call myself a democratic socialist because I believe that the majority of politicians who are democratic socialists or who call themselves social democrats are less influenced by corporations or the American aristocracy. And of course, democracy is a fundamental tenet of the people being in control, and fundamental tenet of this ideology.
Very good. How are you going to achieve this end goal?
So this is an interesting question. As you said, I'm an archaeologist, and so I study how the will of the people is enacted over time, what roadblocks they encounter, and the charismatic humans that sometimes lead them away from the common good. So I don't know if there's really a good answer. The majority of instances, historically, prehistorically, where people are successful in being heard have required some sort of reckoning, right? So a revolution, not so peaceful protests, taking down the people at the top. I study my archaeology, and this is actually one of the ways that the Maya really changed from the classic period to the post-classic period. It was actually, a period of reckoning. And then if we think about American history, the peaceful protests that we celebrate now in relation to the civil rights movement weren't actually so peaceful. MLK was supported by months of rioting prior to the Civil Rights Act. And the Civil Rights Act wasn't actually passed after MLK was murdered. It was passed after more months of rioting. So it was passed through kind of a fear of continued violence. So I don't really know if that certainly answers your question. But maybe, things are cyclical, and progress is sometimes slow, but it's kind of, there's spikes of, activity, in this progression. It's not just the slow march forward, I think.
All right, cyclical. Yeah, I'm reading Pocock's Machiavellian Moment right now, and he talks about the cyclical as opposed to linear. Yeah, so you already talked about how archaeology has influenced your political beliefs. What other influences? How did you come to these beliefs? Are there more influences?
Yes, many more influences. I grew up in a very conservative and religious household. My parents were Republicans. My grandparents, who lived closest to me, were Republicans. Every adult in my life growing up was a Republican. And because of the type of Republicans that my family was, there was this kind of the culture of political staunchness and maybe an aversion to the other, which of course, as an archaeologist now, I see that from kind of like a social theory lens, and the reasons for that, etc. But when I left my parents' house, it still took me a while to figure out that I could actually form opinions on my own. And now we hadn't been well off when I was growing up. We experienced a lot of food insecurity, but there was always like a front that we put up, a facade. And so our nails were always cut. My brother's hair was combed a certain way. The grass was always mowed. But behind that facade, money was always an issue that we really struggled with, and it was a constant source of stress. And then, even as an adult, that really hasn't changed for me. I'm 33, and the most money that I've ever made in a year is $20,000 on a fellowship. So, money is one of those things that is still a source of stress in my life. And I am on a trajectory where I'm going to be fortunate enough to, not be stuck in that forever because of my degrees. However, I still consider myself really fortunate to, have even had that over the last decade. I know what it's like to not know where your next meal is coming from. And I know what it's like to work as hard as you can and it not be good enough. So to answer your question, I came to my political beliefs through this kind of struggle. And I don't want other people to have to experience that same thing. I don't want them to experience food insecurity. I want them to have access to the resources they need to live fulfilling lives: food, shelter, healthcare, both physical and mental health. Because if we go through our lives without even that, what's the purpose? So.
Thank you. Can you give an overview of the history of your ideology?
Yeah, so I'm, again, not a political scientist, but the roots of democratic socialism come from, well, in part from Great Britain in the 19th century. There was a movement toward public ownership of the means of production, a Chartist movement, which also advocated for the voting rights of all men at the time. So basically, it was a movement of the people. Around this time, as far as Americans go, Henry George had the Geoist movement. This kind of idea, a lot of the ideas in democratic socialism get misunderstood or, boiled down to this talking point that isn't really the purpose of the talking point. But George believed that though people should be able to own what they produce, anything that comes from the land, so natural resources, the land itself, etc., should be something that is shared. And I think this is one of the reasons why democratic socialism can work within the confines of capitalism. So it's not like we need to dismantle our current system. It can actually work within it.
Okay, so work within it. What are there any symbols of your ideology?
So traditionally in the 19th century, the rose has been a symbol of, socialism and democratic socialism. However, more recently, I feel like Bernie Sanders has been so associated with the movement of, democratic socialism, social democrats, that any cartoon imagery, even Bernie's hair or the bird that landed on his podium. I think it was in Idaho, the bird that landed on his podium at the rally. Yeah. I think that has become more closely linked as recognizable symbols, related to the movement.
Okay. The next question is, how statist are you? How important is the state?
So I think that states have a right to govern themselves, so long as the ways in which they're governing themselves aren't detrimental to the health and well-being of their people. So the entire idea of being in a country is that you benefit from, the things that kind of conglomerate offers, right? So that means money, trade routes, roads, that kind of thing. as far as, working toward the common good, Alabama, which is where I currently live, would have absolutely held out longer on civil rights issues had there not been other pressure from outside of the state. So I think that as a whole, it's important to remember that being a part of a country means that you're working together to accomplish things for the common good and for all people. So, in that way, I think that I'm pro state rights as long as they are not detrimental to the people in that state.
What are your views on private property?
So, as an archaeologist, I think this idea is a little silly. The vast majority of Americans, as we're all aware, live on the traditional lands of indigenous people who we forced off of them. Whenever I hear someone say something like, this land has been in my family for 10 generations, I kind of want to add, well, it was in theirs longer. But like the idea of personal possessions kind of has a similar background. Like we can trace consumer culture right now to a specific historic ceramics company. I believe it might be Wedgwood. Don't quote me on that. But we can actually look at when our current consumer culture kind of started, and I think that leads to a lot of selfishness and kind of holds us back now. Our views of personal and private property, but we also need to understand the distinction between personal and private property. For example, Marxism isn't talking about taking away your toothbrush. It's about people can still own things, but communally we should maybe own the means of production, right? So there's a difference, I think, that people need to understand between like a landlord being a landlord and owning a kitchenette, if that makes sense.
Okay, good. How do you define liberty? Non-domination or non-interference?
Non-domination or non-interference. So I am more for like, it's negative versus positive is another way we could talk about that, right? So
yeah, I stopped using those terms because not a lot of people understand.
Okay. So I'm more for positive liberty, like being able to have the resources and access, etc., necessary without that kind of roadblocks to be able to not necessarily fulfill your dreams or things like that, but to be able to have like life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? But I think that negative liberty, so like the non-interference, is a little, I don't know, it's a little childish or selfish to me, I think. Like the what comes to mind off the top of my head, because I know a lot of people in wildlife management, is the protesting about paying for a fishing license or a hunting license or things like that. And there are actually really good wildlife management reasons that they do draws for tags, etc., and why you need a fishing license and why you have to fish in a particular way, because it's actually torture for the fish if you do it's kind of a lazier way of fishing. But yeah, so absolutely I'm more on the positive liberty side of things than negative liberty.
All right, very good. And how does one preserve liberty? What are the ways to preserve liberty?
I think that the best way to preserve liberty is through the continued advocation of human rights. I know that some ultra conservatives see liberty in the buzzword sense, and that there are these dark forces that are, out there trying to take away their right to, you know, do whatever. But the reality is that the greatest threat to liberty is a threat to human rights. Um, I am pro-choice, and when I was in Guatemala for the last, well, 2 months over the summer, I went there and I came back and Roe versus Wade had been, overturned. And so while I was away for just that short while, I feel that America decided to infringe on my liberties as a female citizen. As far as other civil rights issues go, Black men not being able to walk down the street in 2022 without being harassed, that is, an infringement on their civil liberties. So I think that things that really do infringe on our civil liberties are these human rights issues. It's not the little things like, do I have to pay for a fishing license? That is really what's the problem, I guess.
So are you just recommending that through legal means, through laws, that liberty is preserved, or are there other methods for
I
doing that?
mean, I legally, of course, that is the end all, right? That's
Yeah.
where it needs to end up, is in text form signed by the government. But as far as the ways that we achieve that, I feel like it's going to take a lot of petitioning, protesting, etc., to actually get to that point.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. How do you view class?
So I see class as one of the greatest dividers of our time. The American dream involves this idea of being able to move up across social classes, upward across those boundaries. But there's been several studies that show that that's really not possible. The majority of people who are born into a class, a certain socioeconomic class in America, stay there. And our current class system, I feel, is more closely related to the caste system. And I think that most Americans are not comfortable acknowledging, really how difficult it is to move across those social boundaries. But, it absolutely is. I'm a first generation college student. And like I said, I'm 33 and still haven't, made even what my dad was making when I was growing up. And we were, food insecure. So it's really, really hard to navigate that in the way that we like to imagine that the American dream works.
Do you think class identity is important, or is it something we shouldn't consider?
I think that it's one of those things that it matters, and it's so ingrained in how we view other people, how we view ourselves, our motivations, etc., that we need to consider it because, there's really no getting around it. However, I feel that if we moved beyond those kind of class boundaries, maybe we'd be more successful as being a country that's kind of on the same page, and maybe more successful in making sure that our people have access to the kinds of things that they need.
So what needs to be done about inequality?
Okay, so first I would say that mental health care is a big thing. Mental health needs to be addressed in America, and not just mental health awareness, because we're all very aware that there's a mental health problem. But we actually need tangible answers and ways that we can help people with mental health issues. There are mental health problems in my family that have been very, very difficult to solve because of the socioeconomic status thing. And, you know, the majority of homeless individuals aren't homeless because they're lazy or because they're on drugs, especially here in Tuscaloosa. It's because they have debilitating mental health issues that are not being addressed by the system. There are not systems in place to get them the help that they need. So that's first and foremost. I think that would greatly help in addressing inequality. And second, I think that we should stop cutting money to social programs. You know, I grew up and like I said, in a house where we didn't have a lot of money. It was a constant source of stress. My parents were very, very hardworking. You know, like I said, conservative, religious Republicans, very, very hardworking. And yet social programs, you know, the reduced food lunches for my brothers and I, etc. All of these things were integral in making sure that I actually had food to eat at school, and, you know, was able to grow up in a somewhat stable environment. So I think we need to make sure that those programs aren't getting cut any further.
I'm just curious because you have quite a background in academia. Is education important to the to doing something about inequality? What are your thoughts on that?
Yes. I think that education is hugely important. I think that we are not paying teachers what they are worth. I think we're not pumping nearly enough money into our education system. I know that Idaho has a fairly low budget compared to many states as far as our education goes. Although I think that it was recently raised.
Yeah,
it's hard to follow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So well, you can watch my video on it actually.
Okay, sounds good. But yeah, so, you know, I think that it is one of the things that has helped me become successful. And it's not just access to education at you know, primary school, secondary school level, it's continued education after that. You know, the reason why I was able to get my education is because I got my first 2 degrees at a fairly inexpensive College of Southern Idaho. And I was able to pay for that out of pocket. You know, so making sure that even those resources aren't being taken away, that going to the College of Southern Idaho is still manageable for working class people. I think that is also hugely important. So education clear across the board, I think, is something that, you know, we need to realize has great value.
Right. All right. Thank you.